Hi. So. See, I've seen the shows. Yeah. The folks that are online, if you go to Saturday, you're going to have to make 4 days. Right, exactly. I get it. I can go. Yeah. Oh, I mean, oh, yeah. So it's and this summer, she's supposed to be working on the beach. But this wasn't even today. It's not a big one. She doesn't have that right now. She's just it's like, yeah. I look at it. I spend my job. I think it's right. Start like ready. Hi. Yeah. Relaxing. Like nice feeling. That's just how it is. Yeah. It's much better. Sure. Oh, man. My sister. Yeah. Yeah. So then she was our dad. You're doing the one of the administration. Well, yes. So like. Even though they care more about. So I think. Yeah. It's very. We're just, we're meeting with our. So he was. And. Just doing so like it's like now. Like it's right behind.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good with the, I think we're good with the video. Sorry, I thought we were actually scheduled for 10. So I've been chatting away. Good morning and thanks for being here today. My name is Matt Heckles. I'm the director at SHA. Let's just start with some introductions. And while the folks in the room are doing introductions live, let's have the folks who are joining us via video just put your name and the organization that you're representing in the chat so we can record your attendance. But you're in the room. Let's start with you, Carrie.
I'm Carrie Casey, and I'm here representing Newcastle County Executive Emergency.
Steve Yateman with the Delaware Children's Department.
Brady Nallman, representing Todd Lawson.
Rachel Stucker, Housing Alliance, Delaware.
Good morning, Deborah Huey, Department of Education, representing Secretary Martin.
Hello, Lucretia Moultrie, Department of Labor.
Matt Heckles, DSHA.
Alex Bodez, DSHA. Kevin Sippel, County Administrator for Kent County. Good morning, Robin Christians, Mayor of the City.
Good morning, Sarah Taylor, Commissioner of Corporate Affairs. Jessica Klein, Planning Research and Management.
Lisa Kent, representing Delaware Continuum of Care.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Kendra Johnson.
Morning, everyone. Javier Horseman from Mayor Carney's office.
Stephanie, representing TCJ.
Hi, Alice Davis, DSCJ.
Michelle Stater, DSCJ.
Good morning, I'm Alicia Collins, I'm in for Dr. Jania Redding at the YMCA of Delaware. Sonia Starr, I'm here with, husband Mike. Hi, I'm Judy Rail with the University of Delaware.
Hi, Melissa Ziegler from the Delaware State Housing Authority.
I'm Ashley Dawson with Delaware State Housing Authority. I'm Emily, intern at the DSHA.
Shannon, intern at Delaware State Housing Authority.
I'm tonight, I'm on.
Jennifer Cullen, emergency management coordinator at DSHA.
Hi, Karen Aller, member.
Emily Cunningham, DSHA. Amelia Ramsden, housing lines number.
I think that's everyone. Well, thank you, and glad to see that we have interns in the room. I think when I look around state government in general, and certainly in housing, it's good to have people who are interested in this kind of work. And, appreciate the work that they've been doing at DSHA, for Department of Corrections as well. So the minutes from the last meeting were emailed to you. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about the minutes? Are they on our website too? Are they on our website?
Yeah.
The minutes are on the website if you haven't taken a look at it. You can go back and relive the glory of that May 13th meeting. What to do a motion and all? Nothing or? Okay. Can I have a motion to adopt the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second that.
All right. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. All right. So at the last meeting, we talked about sort of the vision for this collaborative and the idea that through its makeup, we're focused primarily on trying to get a handle on how we are all investing in our homeless services system around the state. And so, if you look at the constitution of the collaborative membership, it's primarily entities, public entities that have a funding role, either at the state, local, or federal level. And so one of the first things that we thought we ought to do is try to understand how that funding is working. And so I want to start with a thank you to the members who were able to respond. And we got a pretty good response to the survey that we put out that was asking questions about the funding sources that you have at your disposal and how those funds are deployed into this work. So we're going to start with, and there's the slide that says thank you for the message. Once the survey results came back to DSHA, we started to take a look at what was submitted. And so I thought we would start today with a review of that information and then talk about sort of the next steps of how we will redefine some of that data. Let's see, I think Alex, you're going to walk us through the definitions of homelessness, which we've talked about, I think, a little bit in the past, but want to make sure we remind people of that. And then also we'll walk through some of the different surveys.
Show next slide. Awesome. So I echo what Director Heckle said. I want to thank everybody for filling out the survey. I know my staff and I were going back and forth with a lot of folks on getting all the activities, property information, program information submitted. So really appreciate all the communication last weeks. So I want to talk about the definition of homelessness and particularly why it's important. Depending on the agency or organization, homelessness is defined differently. And it's important to agree on sort of standard HUD definitions for homeless populations before we start really analyzing the data that has been submitted. A shared understanding ensures that we're all speaking the same language, that we're all on the same page in terms of talking about the different populations represented in our homelessness system. And it's important to have this sort of consistent approach before we start this phase one of our analysis. And so this agreement between all of us will help us avoid misinterpretation or misunderstanding, and it'll ensure that our strategies are consistent across the collaborative group here. And so, for the sake of our work with the collaborative, we'll hope to agree on these definitions outlined in the next slide. Excuse me. And if I'm looking down, I'm just kind of referring to my notes.
You can't read that.
Yeah.
At least I can.
Exactly. So here we define each of the qualifying homeless populations per HUD, and these might look very familiar. We included these on the survey and asked, based on the program you submitted or activity you submitted, what populations do you serve? Could be one or two or all the above. And so first, talk about literally homeless. It's individuals or families with lack of fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence and are living in shelters or places not meant for habitation. This could be transitional housing is included with the literally homeless. And then places not meant for habitation, you think of streets, you think of cars, you think of abandoned buildings, things such of that nature. Main driver of this sort of situation, its loss of housing has already happened, right? So no access to other housing options are available for this population. And immediate needs with this population include emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, and stabilization services. So that's the literally homeless qualifying subpopulation. The next one is at risk for homelessness. This is an individual or family at imminent risk of homelessness, those who will lose their primary residence within 14 days and have no alternative housing options or resources. So this is a population that is currently housed, but they don't have safe alternative options or resources past that 14-day period. The main driver of this sort of crisis could be eviction, could be job loss, could be informal living arrangements ending, and the type of immediate needs for this population. It might be something like rental or utility assistance, landlord mediation, crisis prevention. It's more about preventing that state of homelessness from happening. And then the last population is the fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence or other dangerous situations such as assault. And so this is any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, has no other residence, and lacks the resources or support networks to obtain other permanent housing. This, housing status, this individual may have to stay, may have a place to stay, but it may be unsafe or unstable. They might be temporarily doubling up or trying to stay in that dangerous condition. And so obviously an immediate need of this population is immediate safety and protection, legal support, trauma-informed counseling, things of that nature. And so those are the three qualifying populations. Are there any questions or comments on those?
So the three categories in the world, and look to Rachel, to access shelter, right? You would have to be literally, right? Or can you be at risk?
So you don't. So I think so. It can be both. By the time you are walking into the front door of a shelter, because that's where you need to be, you're livable.
Okay.
So, like people can kind of go back and forth between the two depending on their situation, right? We have people who reach out to us all the time who I'm sleeping in my car tonight, but for the last 2 weeks I was at my aunt's house and I don't know where I'm going to go tomorrow. right? So yesterday they were at risk, today they're literal, tomorrow if they're in a shelter, they're gonna be, right? So like, it's fluid, the human. So it's not necessarily an eligibility, so like, yes, and
If
no,
someone
if that
calls
makes
it, if someone calls and says, I'm living on my parents' couch and I might have to be out of, would that be getting an access?
that would not be the first person be prioritized for shelter access. Generally, that's correct.
Because I know that with the COC stuff, sometimes because we get so much HUD money, we always live by that literal homelessness, but there are people like in jail. I mean, there are people in hospitals. There are we get a lot of youth, like they come to the Hope Center that are like aging out of foster care or living on a couch somewhere that wouldn't necessarily meet the definition at the time. And we were always thinking that we need to look for funding for those other categories, right? I mean, that's my only thing. It's we're looking literal homelessness, which is how I defined it. Are we going to hinder the ability to help people that are really that way too? They just don't need that.
And I know where you're going with that. And I think that it's not necessarily the definition we need to challenge, but it's the eligibility and how we process the definitions. Because we do make people be in crisis, and once they're in that state of crisis, the literal homelessness, we're taking that prevention that's where we need to probably focus. Anyway, yeah, I think the definition's fine. I think how we have used that definition for eligibility has been a problem.
Well, and just to add real quick, I also just think it's that when people are at risk, there are little to no resources available to help.
Right.
So what we're doing is, again, I don't know that it's the definition. I think it's that we don't have resources when they're at risk. So it's not
To
until they.
prevent.
Right, exactly.
Because we don't have the prevention dollars, we have the crisis dollars.
It's like call back when you are like.
Yes, yep.
Sometimes the state service center, people call me and I said, well, you actually have to not be evicted next week.
Right.
Like, well, then you can't call to, that. So you're right, it's all definitions. So.
Yeah.
So long story short, it seems good.
Yeah. I think that's super critical, because that's why you wanted to bring the definitions so we would all agree. And I think that's the definitions are fine, but our eligibility and how we process them, I think that's a challenge for this committee.
Yep, and I think, kind of mentioning that there's a gray area sometimes with these population in terms of, someone fleeing domestic violence might be literally homeless, right? Like, these aren't populations that are completely siloed away from one another. There's some sort of connections there as well. I think, a big difference being the current housing status. There's no access to other housing options with literally homeless, whereas the others, it's more at risk. And so that's kind of the difference.
And the trauma that creates for households. I mean, constantly you call for people that are I'm being evicted in a week and I have nowhere to go and there's no prayer group. That is a huge issue. So I think that's what, we always talk about prevention is where really we should focus.
Right. And so I appreciate the feedback on the definitions. And I think, having that consistent sort of agreement on the definitions will be great. Because we're thinking about a starting point in terms of this analysis and, where do we start and then how do we work along sort of the spectrum of populations in a sort of process to address housing needs. And so I think that's what Director Eccles will talk about on the next slide here with how do we arrive at a meaningful focus for a start.
So I don't know if Carrie was reading ahead. But I think this is really important for us as a collaborative because, but what I was sort of reminded of when thinking about this was, some 15, 20 years ago when I was involved in the very first Delaware Interagency Council to End Homelessness and its report that created a 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness. And number one in the plan was something like, build 20,000 affordable housing units. And, I always, when I think about that now, I don't know what I was thinking then, but when I think about that now, I think that doesn't really help us. necessarily. It's true, right? But that's not something that, I want to make sure that we're focused on things that the collaborative can really accomplish. Creating that kind of affordable housing supply is certainly, like I said, a good thing for us to strive for. But if we focus on that, we're going to miss I think the nuts and bolts of what we can do within the confines of this group. So I wanted to talk about that, even if you ignore sort of that affordable housing goal, the type of the definitions that we just talked about, and the type of programming that links up to those challenges. My thinking was that we should be focused first, and I want to emphasize, maybe bold and underline the first, on those who are literally homeless in our emergency shelter system. Again, I don't want to suggest that we don't need to also talk about prevention and permanent supportive housing and all of the other pieces here. But to take off bites that we can chew, should we be thinking about that literally homeless in our shelter system first? Part of that for me is because I think that's where maybe people are most in need. Not to say that they aren't in need when they're at risk and have an eviction notice that's going to be effective next week. But if we talk about people who are literally homeless, I think those are the people in highest need. And that might be the best place for us to start. But I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to sort of talk that through, and maybe this group feels like it can tackle more than, take more bites than that. But that's what I wanted to sort of open the floor with here and talk through with this group. Yes.
Is there any data that delves into what dynamics create the at-risk status? So are there certain situations that are conducive to putting families at risk that we can consider address through this body?
We can, if you're talking about Delaware specific data, I don't have like a report I can hand to you at the moment. But there is a lot of just research that's been done about what creates the most risk for homelessness at the community level. That is increases in rent, and so the community level. When you see, they've done studies nationwide. So communities that show the highest increases in rent over time, like one community, their rent increased by 10%, another community increased by 30%. The community where rent increased by 30% saw a much higher increase in homelessness than the community where rent increased by 10%. It also has to do with rent vacancy rate. So if you have a really tight rental market and there's nowhere else for people to go when they lose their housing, though that also contributes to increases. Right. So back to Matt's, this group isn't necessarily producing 20,000 places in affordable housing, but that is like the biggest contributor at the community level to increases in rates of homelessness. At the individual level, there's all those other factors and who is most at risk in that market of becoming homeless. So that's a lot of the things that I think we talk about a lot of the time. So things like poverty, lack of job, layoff, mental illness, substance use disorder and addiction, involvement with the criminal justice system in and out of institutions. Right, there are a lot of other things, familial trauma, breakdown of community ties, lack of community support. I think a lot of folks who work directly with people experiencing homelessness, I've heard say this, that everyone's situation is a little bit different. Very different actually, in terms of their individual story that led them to becoming homeless. But two of the things that are the same across everybody is they don't have housing, they don't have money for housing. And then the other one is the lack of like familial and community supports to be safely housed while they figure it out. Right. So they don't have a friend or a family member they can stay with while they're figuring out, or they don't have that other type of social or financial capital to help them with it. But that's my brief answer. I don't know if that's helpful.
What about for kids
you answer her.
Well, I mean, we usually ask Rachel to answer the data questions, but I thought
Yeah,
she.
yeah.
I mean, frankly, so we always say that the things that biggest needs for children that we have in our foster system. Stable housing. Employment for adults in their life, whether biological parents or not parents. And mental health and substance abuse, the same things that she just said. Which is kind of, so when we talk about the housing, I think I kind of mentioned last time. For us, it starts on the prevention side. I get you want to talk about these folks in the shelters right now. I think the two can tie together because I think I asked last time, what is it considered like a best practice like period, from on house to house, right? And obviously the answer is quickly as possible, if I remember correctly, right? But for me, it's like that continuum for our families is about 2 years, right? We were talking about getting someone to be stable enough to change their situation of unemployment or unemployment, right? To be able to save enough money in some cases. Either on a voucher perhaps to get first month's rent, last month's rent. A lot of our families have already arrears with utilities. That's not a 90-day process for our families. So for me, when we talk about the housing, my mind goes to the utopian, right? There's a lot of things in play to get someone out of a shelter, right? And I look at a model like the Hope Center. We have a contract with them. I don't work for them. Not trying to sell them, right? But like when they brought in like Christianity here to do some of the medical, like those are the types of programs that we need. When they have folks from like labor come in and talk about like the job readiness piece, those are the things that I think we get a family, for us as a family, onto a path of long-term stabilization as opposed to just the house, right? And that's the way we're always going to think. So for us, if we got a call for a family saying that the child was living, typically a lot of times it's that middle definition, right? Like they're couch surfing somewhere, they're staying with other folks. That kid is safe, and that looks to be stable for a period of time. We would not enter a child into the foster system simply because they don't have their own address, right? We would expect the other pieces to kind of kick in, right? Like the McKinney-Vento, we wouldn't want kids' school to change, we wouldn't want all that to happen. But that is not a reason we would enter a child into foster care. Now they're in the car, right? They're living, I think from some of the times we get like, look, I'm living wrong, right? I'm under the bridge, I'm in that public space. Probably going to have that child in foster care. So for us, all those things go together.
But that's also the piece that you added there with the family and community support, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I just want to add, when we talk about the shelter group or the at-risk group, they're not static populations, right? People are moving through the shelter system all the time. There's a cohort of people that are from shelter to shelter to shelter and are not resolving their homelessness, and they're homeless for long periods of time. But a lot of folks, more than half of folks, again, new people are coming into shelter every day and people are okay and going somewhere else. So I think the idea, it's not like a static group of people.
Yeah.
It's part of that like larger system of people coming and going.
Because we can't have intact families stay together. We often will have the child staying with someone that the parent agreed to, right? They're staying with a cousin, an aunt, a grandparent, a family friend, while the parent may be getting a shelter.
Yeah, I get a lot of calls from parents whose kids are currently staying with someone else.
But I'm sorry, I know you wanted to say, like that 2-year period for me is like, that's the period where I think sometimes as a system, statewide system, we start to pull back services that I think are benefiting family in those cases, right? Because they have the house, right? They've got a voucher, they're in a house, and for some reason, our system tends to pull back some of the other services that were surrounding them. And that's what I think I would like to see change through this collaborative, is have a long-term commitment from all those involved that, look, they got the house, they have a voucher, even if it's voucher, but now we still need to keep those services available, whether it's children's department, DHSS, whomever. We can't just pull back.
Yep.
Thank you. No, I felt you said a lot of what I was feeling.
My wife says.
Let me talk. That's what I say to my husband. I'm like, we have to find a way where both of these things are happening at the same time. right? Because if we're solely focused on, what is happening in the shelter, then we'll never have a system large enough that's always going to be able to accommodate the next wave. And what, just like I think about, is on another thing, think about the opioid thing. A big part of that is prevention. I don't want you addicted and I don't want you to die. Therefore, we put, we acknowledge where you are and get your substance use support. But I want to support you before you get to that place. And what does that support look like? Unfortunately, too many times, like you said, okay, they got a house, they're good. Well, no, if you did not address all of those other factors, going to be right in place again. And not to, because I don't get paid by the Hope Center either. However, being a human services professional and having a general understanding of what happens in the Hope Center, they're looking at that individual and they're looking at all of the aspects of their life. So if that means you need a medical professional, if that means behavioral health, if that means, social services, and, we have to figure out how we do both of these things. And I agree with you. 20,000 units, yay! Guess what? If we don't deal with all of those other things,
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Yes.
Well, I don't agree with what you made, but I want to swing back to something that somebody said about the lack of community support. One of the questions that I get as mayor of the city of Dover from people that as mayor, their concerns are how many of these folks that we deal with on my streets in Dover are actually Delawareans. And I've had the opportunity to talk to some of the homeless folks in my community. Not even from Delaware, they're sent here or they migrate here. I don't know if that plays a factor in it, but one of the things that has galvanized efforts to help the homeless in our community is a lot of my citizens have stepped back from the process of having co-purpose shelters, different things like that throughout the community, because these folks that have come for services come to Dover have no support system other than they show up because they're not local folks. And I don't know if that plays a factor, if we're just mean in Dover or what the story is, but I get the packet of people that migrate to our state. But are we overlooking our own folks that have been here for a long time? We probably should have been addressing this issue a long time ago. Delawareans that actually need some kind of community support. Yeah. So I don't know if I spoke out of turn, but I see that as an issue. And I think it's addressed. We help the Delawareans. Taking on somebody else's.
Yes.
I'm gonna one thing. So the discussion we're having, it sounds like a lot of people are firm believers in the Hope Center model. And I've seen it myself, especially with labor's small contribution to the work being done there. But it also makes me think about, at the Department of Labor, the staff has really thought about meeting people where they are and making the resources accessible. And while we may not be in a position to create a Hope Center in every county, at Labor, we have this concept of our American Job Centers being a one-stop shop, right? But it can't really be a one-stop shop unless we're addressing all the dynamics that we're talking about, right? So we have been having some conversations about how we expand services there, right? And even enhance labor services, because the conversation that we had earlier about increases in rent and layoff, taking a moment to make sure we're educating people about what exists, but what the cost of living is and what you need to earn in order to have a living wage, and reskilling and upskilling workers for the market that they actually live in, the economy that they actually live in. So I guess my hope is through this group that we can think about how we create these one-stop hubs throughout Delaware where people can access all of the services we're talking about: employment, training, substance abuse, mental health services, housing information, all of those things.
I'm going to add to that, if we're all saying that is most likely the long-term fix that is needed. I guess my next question would be, do we have like a funding analysis as far as how much funding is going towards these Band-Aids that tend to create this revolving door? And could you combine some of the funding for that revolving door to give us the funding pot that would be useful for the longer term fix? Could we look at that?
Yeah. So I want to pause so we can get to the survey results. Otherwise, I don't know, we haven't accomplished what we wanted to do today. But no, I appreciated this conversation. I think we're going to do this and then come back to it. And so, as we go through this next phase, we're going to highlight some examples, because when the survey results came back, we could tell that there isn't real agreement. When we asked, what programs do you have that serve this population in our state, we got a lot of different answers. And some, we looked at, we're like, yep, that is about homelessness. And then others were like, well, maybe. And again, that's where I want us to try to define that better so that we're really focused on the systems. And to me, this group is about the system, the interactions, the collaboration between the funders, the providers, and making sure that system as a whole is providing the best services that we can. So let's go through the survey results, and we'll talk a little bit more about this focus area that we need to come to.
Yeah, so we talked about the qualifying populations in terms of the definitions and the sort of similarities and differences between the definitions. And then we asked you all, based on your programs, activities, departments, which of these populations do you serve? 1, 2, or all of the above. And so we looked at this chart here. As you can see, we marked an X if that agency served that population. So part of why we reached this sort of conclusion and arrived at this particular suggestion was because most all agencies that responded did say that they had programs that focused on the literally homeless. Whereas you see it prevalent, but not as prevalent with the fleeing DV assault population, and then even less prevalent than the at-risk for homelessness population. And so we looked at this chart, and this was sort of part of the conclusion in terms of, we have everybody seated at the table here. We all have our respective programs. Given that we all have some involvement with the literally homeless, or just about all, this could be a good starting point. Doesn't necessarily, disregard the need or need for investment for those other populations. I think that's something that we continue to say is incredibly important. And honestly, I think, the fact that there's not as much representation for those other groups might only, highlight the urgency of the need for those populations as well. That's something we plan to get to. We just arrived at this starting sort of focus area through some of the data that we had from the survey.
Yes.
Okay. Did the city of Wilmington, city of Dover not respond, or did they just not indicate they served any of the population? I'm just curious. Like,
I told you, we're meeting. No, we don't, our charter doesn't provide for us.
Right.
to do any social service work or anything, but that's not saying we don't work with, for community development, block grant director. We have, emergency housing managers. But
That's
we have
what I
limited
thought, right.
resources. We do help with, certain payment for the first time orders, assistance of some type, but it doesn't address those three categories. So that's why we have no response.
No, that's fine.
In
I just
addition
wasn't
to
sure.
me.
Okay.
Uh,
I was like-
But the fact of the matter is that, do it. But once again, we're limited by our charter and by our citizens to take involved in those three categories that are listed.
Gotcha. Like I know the city of Wilmington has emergency solutions grant money, and G money that directly funds homeless assistance programs that serve literally homeless households and at-risk households. So that's why I didn't know that was, I guess I just wanted to make sure it was like,
We felt we didn't pass the acid test.
because I think people should be thinking about their role differently, whether it's direct funding, direct service versus funding service providers.
Sure.
So
Well,
I just
and
don't know.
again, so I think
just
with
wanted
any
to-
survey, and I'll say at least with this survey, that's part of why we wanted to submit, the sort of first look at this. I think that we wanted to talk through, and so the homework assignment, not to jump ahead too much, will be to kind of refine some of this and get there. So I don't recall if we got a response from the city. That might have just been, but you're maybe when
Yeah, I think, the way we look at it, we do a lot like the city of Dover does. We don't fund directly to homeless service providers. We use more.
But ESG, you do, right?
We do, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
okay.
do.
So, so we'll follow up and we'll make sure
I
that we get that.
think as the county, I mean, we looked at it as like directly like providing it to someone. So, but we also do at risk. So
Okay.
maybe we missed, you know what I mean? Like, I think we were looking more at like direct service stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Instead of what our ESG is. So maybe that we need to go back and
Well,
we can prevent.
like I said, that's what we're hoping to do between now and the next
Okay.
meeting, is to sort of refine some of this. I mean, the first was sort of like, cast a wide net and we'll come back. So both in terms of a better understanding as we talk through, and it's easier to understand what I think we need to sort of put on the table in terms of the resources so that we can map them, but also the focus area where we want to focus this initial step. So Alex is going to talk about a couple of examples, and I think that will also help to sort of think through how to refine these survey responses and the data that we're putting together here.
So we weren't exempt from the homework assignment of completing the survey. So we completed the survey, and we kind of did the new homework assignment of revising the survey together. And so I'll go through two programs that we submitted in the survey and sort of how we revised it given the new sort of focus. And I want to thank my DSHA staff for helping me with this. I'm not a subject matter expert in these programs, but I definitely have been learning. So the Home for Good program is a partnership between DSHA and the Federal Home Loan Bank in Pittsburgh. It awards grants to selected nonprofit organizations who support initiatives in Delaware or individuals and families who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And so we looked at the funding amounts. You see about $1,450,000 in total, and then those different sort of buckets. And so we looked at these buckets and we said, okay, what part of these buckets serve the literally homeless, and then what parts serve the at-risk? And so, of the programs that assist households that meet the definition of literally homeless, it's about the challenges of obtaining permanent housing in a rapid manner. And so that relates to rapid rehousing. Individuals and families are referred to rapid rehousing through Delaware's centralized intake system or a third-party agency. And so, for example, we'll provide money to Salvation Army for their rapid rehousing program. And we've been doing that since about 2022. And so rapid rehousing is a bucket that relates to individuals and households who lack that regular, fixed, adequate nighttime residence. And so that would be a bucket in this program that relates to that literally homeless population, as well as the shelter innovation. Those are funds that are directly related to the infrastructure of shelters. And so you see there, it's about 800,000, about 55% of the Home for Good program that relates to the literally homeless population. And then you have our other programs, the other about 45%, where there's the diversion, the prevention, and the reentry. Those are more about the prevention programs, right? So rental assistance as a last attempt for people to stay in their homes, helping people find, different sort of alternative housing arrangements, targeting services to people sort of as they're seeking shelter at the front door. It's not necessarily about people who are currently in the shelter or on the streets. And so this was the first program that we looked at, and that's kind of how we made that discrepancy between here's the 800,000 that we'll use for this first phase. The other money is certainly important for this process. That will be kind of what comes later. Next slide, Michelle.
Well, I think,
Oh, sorry.
one of the things that struck me with our own sort of analysis here is that within sort of the same quote unquote program, Home for Good, we're funding a lot of different activities. And so that's just something I think that's one of the examples I want to pull up, because I would imagine that as you look through your programs, you may have pie charts that look similar to this, where it accomplishes different outcomes and different goals, or addresses different challenges, and potentially different people in different sort of definitional areas within the same quote unquote program, right?
Do you think, or does this group, the SMEs that are in this room, do you think if any of that 800,000 that is funding towards literally homelessness, do you think if any of that 800,000 was shifted more towards the at-risk population, would you prevent that crisis and then not need as much in that literally homeless? Does that make sense? I think you had other resources. I mean, you guys.
Well, I think the question is whether it's a better investment. If you had $1 to spend, is it better
How do we decide this? Yes. What's the better investment? Is the better investment to take some of that 800,000 and shift it towards the at-risk, or make it eligible for at-risk for prevention, and maybe you don't need as much in the literally, because I think a lot of our population, once they get to that literally homeless status, they're living on the streets, especially for the population that's dealing with mental health, substance use, all these other things. Once they're there, we may have missed them. They may be on a track now that it's hard to get them back.
Yes.
I mean, I would argue we have to do both, right?
Sure.
Like, so, and I think we looked at funding across all the systems and kind of see, like, for this specific funding bucket, I don't know, because I think getting a handle on like the whole picture. But I think if you don't provide that way for people to get out of homelessness, people are going to be stuck longer. But also need to do much more prevention.
Yeah, to put the baby mask on first, but the prevention part to stop the get.
Yeah, I feel like it's both. Like if you,
I agree.
yeah, you just leave people in shelters without any option to exit. I don't think that's good. It's one of those things where I think it's a both and, not necessarily neither or, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, and GSHA, to your credit, you put like tens of millions of dollars of Recovery Act money, housing stability, I mean, that's a, you know what I mean? There was a lot of money for prevention, and you guys have prevented like the tsunami of homelessness because of the amount of money that went into eviction prevention and homeless prevention, but that money is gone, right? We're not having.
Right, and I think that's one way that I look at it. And again, I'm thinking about what this group should focus on. And when it comes to prevention, yeah, on our rental assistance program, we serve thousands and thousands of families. I don't know. I mean, Carrie says we did a good job of preventing homelessness, but we don't So when you do prevention, it's hard to say then, what did you stop from happening, right?
Well, you-
What
You
would
had
happen?
them at eviction and you
Sure,
prevented the eviction.
of course.
And so once you have an eviction or once you, like your folks or any folks, once you have an eviction and you're really gonna be challenged. You're losing people left and right. I mean, I saw it, the amount of money that went into prevention. I just think we need to have that amount of money every year.
So I do think that the people who, in order to sort of end homelessness, we have to prevent it for huge number, right?
And of course, I'm seeing it from my Department of Corrections
Yes.
window and the population that we serve in this
Yeah,
area
yeah,
that we see most frequently.
So
So
those aren't necessarily folks that are on a lease facing eviction. That's like a different type of prevention work, right?
it's more of a security deposit versus.
Right.
The one little piece of data that's missing is like those dollars versus how many touches, how many actual people, were.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay, let's move on.
The next example is our CDBG. So I know most of you know CDBG program. I'll kind of define it. It's a program in 10 Sussex counties that helps prevent homelessness by addressing critical housing infrastructure needs for low and moderate income households. So, this program is much in part about rehabilitation and repair of substandard housing. The program helps individuals and families remain safely housed, and it's preventative, right? It prevents them from falling into homelessness due to unsafe living conditions. And so, this is a program that we submitted. And then, upon further review, we said this is quite preventative, right? This relates a lot to the at-risk population. It will become a part of the process, but doesn't necessarily focus on that literally homeless as much. Something to note is that CDBG does not provide funding specifically for shelter operations. However, it can fund public service improvements, which includes emergency shelter. And so there's a little bit of a connection there. So a small chunk of this would apply. Listed that example, Kent County applied to DSHA CDBG for funding to improve Shepherd's Place in Dover. So there is a small connection, but we really identified this program that we submitted as more pertaining to that at-risk population than the literally.
And part of my homework is we get 15% of our CDBG can be used towards public services, which is like rental assistance things, and we have prioritized rentals. So that, you know what I mean? Like we do use our CDBG for we do home repair and that's because there's such a need for home repair. There's just all these needs and not enough money to go around. But we do 15%, it's about 300,000 of our CDBG most of it goes towards. That was.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons we talked about this one or wanted to present this example is also sort of potential. This is a federal program that has a lot of eligible uses, and trying to get to whether it's used for the purpose of sort of this group on homelessness versus home repair. And again, I don't want to disparage home repair programs. They're critical, right? But this is also a program that has more potential to serve this population. And I think that might be true with some others as well. Okay.
That's a good segue to the next slide. We did reference a program that was submitted, or multiple programs actually that were submitted by DHSS. So as we were not only reviewing our programs and the programs that we submitted, we also reviewed everyone's. And this is just an example of something that we found. We talked about, kind of the energy assistance. So DHSS reported on their LIHEAP funding. I think that's like the low income housing energy assistance program. This is about reducing energy costs, crisis, winter heating assistance, summer cooling assistance, that kind of stuff. So while that is a critical component of assistance to prevent homelessness, right, it keeps people in their homes, creates that sort of sanitary, housing condition. It would not be counted in the narrowed down scope of the literally homeless funding. It serves individuals and helps them avoid entering homelessness in the first place. It's very proactive, but it's not directly, kind of the emergency shelter sort of focus. The other point would be, DHSS would report on their funding for emergency housing services such as hotel, motel, voucher funding, right? That's programs that they submitted that directly relate to that literally homeless population. So that would be a program that would count. But the LIHEAP would be more on the prevention side. This is not to throw DHS under the bus at all. They submitted a ton of information, over 40 pages, speaks to their involvement with the issue and their communication with us on it. It was just an example we figured would be helpful for everybody as they do the assignment.
And I should say Secretary Manning was unexpectedly unavailable this morning and sent her regards and regrets. And I did want to highlight how much they submit to us. They have a lot of programs that, which I think makes a lot of sense, that are impactful here. But again, I think this is another example of sort of how far back do we tie prevention? Giving someone assistance with their oil bill in the winter. You could draw a line from that to homelessness, and I think so. But I wanted to make sure that we had that kind of conversation too about sort of how far out we go to define the scope of this group's work. So let's talk about the sort of the how what you're thinking about these different programs, and again, when I think about it, focusing on that emergency shelter component of this work feels like the best place for us to start. If we try to tie it back to energy assistance programs, if we another good example that was brought up, I think, was addiction. If we try to solve the problem of addiction as a way to solve homelessness, I think we've got too big of a job. And I think that is something that happens a lot with groups that are like this, that are formed to address homelessness in communities, is that it becomes too broad. Homelessness is a symptom of probably, I mean, you said it, Rachel, it's an individualized sort of series of events that led to someone becoming homeless. It's almost probably an infinite sort of set of circumstances and series of events that at any point maybe we could have prevented their homelessness. But how can you possibly sort of fix all of those things when your goal is to end homelessness? And so I think that's where my mind has been when thinking about this group. And maybe it's not so much about sort of the definition of whether you're literally homeless. I think, Rachel, you did a good job of maybe shifting just the last hour of my thinking on sort of whether it should be the definition or the type of services that we're focused on, because people can be very fluidly moving back and forth between those different definitions. But that's where I think we might be able to have the most impact, to make sure that, Steve, to your point, that the system that we create in shelter and emergency housing is providing the right services to lead them towards stability in the long term. So that would mean making sure that our shelters aren't just warehousing people for a night or 30 days, that they have supportive services to make sure that they're connected to Department of Labor employment programs or to substance use, other things like that are perhaps part of the cause and part of the recovery process, but that we really need to focus on sort of that part of our homelessness system within the confines of this group as a first step. But that's just my thinking. I'm really interested in understanding, what this group is thinking about. If that's true, if that's how we're going to approach this, then I think we have a relatively finite set of resources and systems to look at, as opposed to if we are much more expansive in our scope. We're what we look at in this room.
One question is, for the data folks, is there any like generational homelessness? Right? I'm homeless, my kids are gonna be homeless, my mom and dad were homeless, that kind of thing, right? So knowing that, right, if that's a fact, and I agree, you're not gonna hear me say, let's not concentrate on the folks who are literally homeless right now and need shelter services. I think if you got this collaborative going, and you have an opportunity to focus on that while also focusing on folks with very young children. What I'm hearing people say may be wrong, is that there's a cycle going, right? And if you can prevent the cycle, you don't grow up with homelessness, then maybe you don't stand a chance to become homeless as an adult, right? So I think if we just go at the high end services for literally homeless shelter and don't do any work with the families, small children that are growing up to experience it. That's what we're trying to break in, and I don't know how you can focus on that at some level. It's just my 2 cents.
I have two, shockingly, I have 2 cents to share. Also, so I hear what you're saying about focusing on people who are literally homeless. And I don't think it's a bad thing to do, like, that makes sense to me. But I think, kind of back to what I was saying before, I have to think of it as a flow, not like a static part of the system. So if you're gonna focus on folks who are, if we focus, which I think is the right thing to do, on making sure that when people become literally homeless, they have access to the services they need and they can get out of homelessness as quickly as possible and back into stable housing. Because we know the shorter the people experience homelessness, the more likely they are to recover, find stability quicker. There is a component of that that you don't also think about people standing in front of you saying, I need shelter. There's not shelter available. So the two things I would add to that are part of that literally homeless system are people who are unsheltered, either because the shelter, for whatever reason, is not serving them, or they don't want it for whatever reason. So unsheltered as well. And also people who are standing at like the front door and saying, I need shelter. How can we stop them from having to come? So it might not necessarily go all the way back to utility assistance, but there are a lot of people right at that front door saying, I don't know where I'm going to sleep in 2 days. And I think we don't talk, like folks coming out of institutions, that we don't address that like direct immediate pipeline, right? So it might not be going back a month, might not be going back to, then we're gonna be like, something about you're in a boat, you're trying to get the water out before water's coming in, then you're able to get out. And
But your presentation was
Yes.
that.
The bathtub. So I think we need to define it and keep it tight and not go out to all of the problems of the world 100%. But I think if we don't pay at least attention to the people who are like right there and need shelter now but aren't getting it, then we're missing an important part of the system.
Here's the other way that I've been thinking about it lately is that homelessness is a housing problem, a lack of housing problem. It isn't a problem of substance use. It isn't a problem of mental health or loss of job. It's a problem of someone being unhoused. Those other things may be the things that cause them to become unhoused, but that the scope of this work really needs to be about that shelter, about that roof over the head, with then layering in the supportive services that allows them to deal with those underlying issues. But those are going to be different from one person to the next. And so, there were a lot of submissions from DHSS, for example, about their recovery housing programs. They are housing people who might otherwise not have housing, but that's not their primary goal. Their primary goal is to work on someone's recovery. And so I think that's the kind of area where I'm trying to make sure that we are focused on the system that we're tasked to address and not get lost in too many other pieces. Any other thoughts?
I think that there's so many, and I do agree with families think that there's, like, if we just focus on literal homeless, we're talking about people like in Wilmington that are on the street where there's no place for them to go, right?
Yes.
Then you're talking about families through DFS or through DHS that,
Yes.
there is a lot of work to be done on the literal homeless access service. right?
And access to the services constructed in a way that's going to help them long term, right? And I think that's I think maybe, midstream here, changing the language a little bit away from literal homelessness to the more thinking about maybe we should define our scope as that shelter and emergency housing system. Whether they are literally homeless or unhoused or immediately at risk, with a tight window on that at riskness, and think about how do we, I think because we know what works in that system. We know that the model, I think, that the Hope Center and others have adopted of giving people time and access to the supportive services to cure those underlying challenges that they have that led to their homelessness and are the barriers to them exiting their homelessness. That's what works, and not all of our shelter and emergency housing system has adopted that model, and so that's where we see inefficiencies. That's where we see barriers to entry. It's where we see people having to move from one place to the other, and perpetuating and making it harder and harder and harder to exit. So that's my thinking on if we can focus on that side, right? We hopefully will be expanding the efficiency, if not the number, but I do hope that we get to the number as well, the qualitative and quantitative issues of our shelter and emergency housing programs.
I have to say something really quickly because I do work for the and it is, I appreciate the good, but it is really hard because it is not abundant. I mean, I'm up at night worrying about every night about how we're going to keep this going. But we don't look at you as a person because we rely on the referral we get and how much funding we get for that. It's not as easy as like you have unlimited time. It's like you get 24 days. If you're doing what you should be doing, we might extend you to 90. I mean, we're adding, we worry about it because we're so worried about money and making sure we keep the lights on and the door open. And, I think it could work, but we're not looking at you as an individual. We're looking at who brought you and how much time we have and how we can make it so that you get where you need to go. But we're not giving, it's hard because it's an unfunded, like many programs, it's unfunded and worrisome. And I'm just.
When people leave the Hope Center, do you know where they're going?
We do because we put them in CMIS, but our outcomes, a lot of times, and we have a wonderful program with DFS. Every 30 days, we're looking at progress. But our results are not like we want them to be. Maybe 40% end up in permanent housing. Some will go to, families, some will go back into a shelter. We don't, but it's at a point where 90 days isn't necessarily cutting it. And we're on the cusp of this other huge grant with U.S. Treasury, where we're going to provide the 2 years of post-supportive cash assistance. But it's very worrisome. Even with all those supports, we're not really looking at you as an individual. We're looking at how we can get you to where you need to be as quickly as possible. And it does add stress to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's with all of this wonderful support on site. And DFS caseworkers on site and DHSS on site. We're trying to do as much as we can, but there's still a lot of worry about where people are.
And I was just going to say, I want us to also be thinking about what the gap is, right? I think that's a real task that we've been given. What would it take?
And I think county government, just to be honest, Newcastle County does not fund. I have to fund, Like I'm trying to show the county that this is actually good investment. So, there's a lot, so it's been challenging. I'm just being completely honest and real here. It's
Really?
not
I
easy.
thought it was peaceful. Okay, never mind.
But we want to, like our partnership with DFS is an excellent example of a partnership where we are working with our case managers, these case managers. We're looking at every obstacle the family has, 30, 60, 90. And they're even extending to 120, 150 days. They're paying for that because they see it, they see on the horizon that this family is going to be housed. Instead of just saying, your money's cut, you're done, you know.
Cost of operations on an annual basis.
It's about 4.1 million, and that's all in with security, transportation, 24-hour staffing, you know, everything. And then we collect about 2.1 in revenue from all the different partners that refer to us, and then the rest is gap funding that we have, grants and other things that we try to get. But, you know, so I'm just, you know, it's not to me for 192,000 square foot building. It's not but you know, it is about a 4 million.
Like you're saying, you have about half of the funding.
We have half the funding, but the rest of it we do, you know, we're still using some of our ARP money. We have, you know, we're making it work. We had some reserve funding because we sort of reserve anyways. But it would be, you know, I'd be happy to like, if we ever wanted to have a meeting at the Hope Center or to present like the model and the gap, just to show you can see it sort of like an example, because I know all the shelters.
Well, and I think we have an immediate, not to get off this topic, but I do want to sort of put out there the other thing that I think we might want to figure out on a little, what's some called a side quest. It is shelter operations. You know, we're in a situation, I think, where we have expanded in some areas because of Recovery Act funding. Some of the system without necessarily knowing exactly how we would, or those organizations without knowing how they will continue to keep their shelters open. And so, yeah,
Just, your question, your concern about funding. You know, I serve on the committee that receives the settlement monies. And they're ready to come into non-funding. So what percentage would you say that people with the hopes that are any situation that we have could be brought back around to actually being caused by drug addiction or substance abuse?
I would say that at least, I'd say 90 to 100 have like a mental health type diagnosis, and we have the bridge plan there. We do have a large percentage of our population with substance abuse disorder, and we did apply for the fund. We are going to get from the latest round. So
I certainly think those funds, that can be well spent to address some homeless issues that we have, because you can't ask Carson County to burden someone or have a pot of money that's available, more money that's coming. And each year, as these settlements come down, and it's long-term money, they could address the very issues that are causing homelessness. It's one of the we really need to take them on. To all of our citizens.
That's super exciting to hear you say. I would love to talk more about that. So you're not mean. Yeah. Because I've thought about how those funds be used to support homelessness, help them with housing, stabilization, because that is part of recovery. Right? You can't. So I'd love to talk more about that. I might corner you.
Yeah, I think that is the route we should go. Other entities cause this problem for us. Part of the problem that we're addressing is people that have substance abuse. So why not take those funds and invest in long-term solutions to fulfill the solution that those people actually.
I feel like it's like funding is sprinkled everywhere, right? This department does this department does this, and God bless you if you can figure it all out, and if you're a case manager that knows all the resources that are available. I really wish there was a way for us to do like this larger analysis on all the funding that we have available and say, let's do it the right way, instead of having, I don't mean to take money from DHSS or DOC or anything like that, but I'm saying DHSS does a little bit of this, DFC may do the same thing, but in a, for a different population, and they do a little bit of this, but you have to have, this is the, you have to sort of meet these needs before you're eligible for this particular funding. We're just all over the place. It feels that way to me, at least, and I'm not, boots on the ground anymore, but just from some of the conversations and being part of larger group discussions, I just feel like if we took a look at everything that could be used towards fixing homelessness, we could get it to it, and think big, not mandate, think big. It could be in a better spot 5-10 years now.
Quick question. When you talked about the length of stay, 24 days, sometimes longer, it gets to 90. Is there like an evidence-based number for that? Or is that number just based on funding streams? Is it based on after 90 days you're expected to be stably housed? Like where are those numbers coming from?
So I can provide a little bit of historical context if that's helpful in terms of where I think. But if anyone in the room has something better or
I'm
different.
only asking if it forwards a conversation.
I think it does.
Really, if it should be longer than 90 days, and that's something we're working towards, right? Or it should be lower.
So I think part of what happened was, so in Delaware law, there is code that says something about emergency shelter stays have to be 30 days or less if you get certain types of DHSS shelter operations dollars, but it can be extended out. There's some language in Delaware law that restricts how DHSS shelter funding can be deployed and how long someone can stay in a shelter that I think should be changed. I think part of why that happened is because there is a vision and a goal that is a good one, which is there's a vision and a goal that is a good one, that people should be rehoused as quickly as possible. That assumes that you have a system in place that is capable of doing that. So making it a rule versus a goal is, I think, where things went a little wrong. Having a 30-day or a 90-day goal to rehouse someone is a good thing, but making it a rule that
That room
right
on your own
is different and probably not.
In the
very
investment
safe to
clause,
do.
you dump that money.
Right, and then, the person has to go to another service provider and start all over again with a case manager, there's no customer services, and it's not, it's a problem. So, I don't know if that's helpful context.
For me, there's a difference between someone who's owning a house, paying a mortgage, doing something, and a tree falls on their house, right? And they got to evacuate for 30 days, as opposed to someone with no job, no car, 3 kids, and all the other issues that we talked about. And I don't know if that's a 30-day or 90-day fix. I know I keep going back to it, but I just, at the end of 90 days, I mean, you're saying 40%. And I think it's less than that for the offenders that I've worked.
So I think you're thinking big, right? I mean, I think that's our job. I just want to make sure that we're thinking big in a limited way. That didn't work, did it? I think that's, but that allows us to do that. If we do have that somewhat limited scope, I think it allows us to really get into it and understand it and find that part of the HSS code, so that we can maybe change that and recreate the system in a way that can fund people for 90 days or 120 days or
Or
or 20
have the next step in the continuum.
Right.
Because you do want to, you want to have the entry for the next person.
Yes.
People can get out.
I think the next step is.
It'll take 2 years, and if you don't have a next step, that's no thing.
Yes.
So is that already a recommendation? All right, write that
I'll
down.
make it.
A sponsor that bill.
Absolutely.
Well, and so to your other point though about the scattered, I've described it as Delaware's homelessness system being a lot of bubbles of very well-intentioned people.
But it's all very good intentions.
Yes. But and I think it's a two-way street. So a shelter has to apply to all of, not only to different programs, but to different agencies. Has to make, and they get 15,000, 20,000, 120,000. It's, you can tell us, I mean, your sources, it's probably a pretty ridiculous process. And so I do think that some collaboration, so that we make that easier. There are different timelines. You may be applying for this grant in September, and then another one, at DHSS in September and DSHA in October. And so it doesn't make any sense. We need to, I think, from an efficiency standpoint, which, it is important here too. How do we relieve some of that pressure on the partners that are providing these services, and collaborate so that the funding is all on the same timeline, perhaps that it is a consolidated application process, that it is consistent in its, and so you don't have different pots of money doing different things.
Does the oversight of that funding sources and the establishments themselves need to be analyzed?
Well, I think
Does there need to
so.
be more accountability and or maybe statewide oversight?
So phase one of phase one, I think, was for us to try to figure out what is out there. What is the universe of the programs that we think, are attempting to address shelter and emergency housing, so that that's the scope of this group's work. I don't know what we do once we figure that out, but I think that is, my hope is that we have a relatively limited source. Based on the survey results, quite frankly, it's not much. That's good news from an operations of this collaborative standpoint, and sort of the analysis of the data standpoint. It's a really bad news from the perspective of how much funding is actually made available through the state of Delaware and some of the other federal programs and local programs that we capture here. There is disturbingly little funding that's available through the state.
Can I add another disturbing fact?
That's the parking agenda, yes.
Great. Just another disturbing fact that may or may not be a fact, but I just wanted to raise it in this meeting is, so for example, through like the First State Community Action, CSBG money supports a lot of caseworkers who work in shelters, right? So that funding goes out to a lot of the homeless shelters. The proposal from the White House is there will no longer be a CSBG program. So shelters will all, like, if that happens next year, most shelters in the state will lose like one of the case managers they have. If there's a proposal that the CBG program just go away.
Yep.
So that could happen next year, and that would not be another source of funding. There's a recommendation that the continuum of care funding get cut in half, or more. So I just, also, not that we have to solve for that right now, but wanted to bring to this collaborative's attention that as we're doing this work, the landscape and the landscape that we are working with, the resources could shift dramatically sooner than we want them to in a way that would not be helpful to our goals. And so thinking about how we leverage state resources, local resources, maybe.
And there may be state resources that being underutilized.
Right. Yep. Right.
Earlier, we mentioned that there is only a hub across the state, and we failed to forget that we have state service centers. All that are certainly.
The one-stop shop of it.
Yeah.
What we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and just to put a finer point on that. So the reconciliation package everyone just heard about, was passed last week. Actually had a couple of positive things for housing in terms of low-income housing tax credit policy. That should be good. What you're talking about is in the administration's budget recommendation. Congress hasn't really started much work on that yet, but the federal fiscal year obviously is not till October, November that we might, if they do a budget, see those impacts flow through to us. But there is certainly a strong philosophy beyond the numbers that the administration is looking to dramatically change its relationship, the federal government's relationship to housing and housing programs, and evolving a lot of that in the states. And so having a stronger network, I think, at the state level and stronger collaboration is good. If nothing changes, is going to be absolutely necessary in parts of the recommended administration's recommended budget get approved. That was the Debbie Downer part of the. Anything else on this part? Is there, and do we think that makes sense as far as a scope for us to think about the idea of focusing primarily on our shelter and emergency housing system, the funding that flows into that relatively narrowly defined set of programs, or out of those programs into providers, with a little bit on the diversion side, and how do we want to define that so that we don't end up talking about utility assistance programs, but don't
Cleveland Clinic has
lose.
the model. So using that model,
Which one? Sorry.
that is the Cleveland Clinic, the diversion at the shelter. So the prevention of at shelter, like keeping you literally at your entryway into the shelter, diversion. If you put that under that scope, it's very different than like the diversion you're thinking.
So not rental assistance, not.
It might be, but
Well,
it's,
I mean like
it's
traditional
really-
rental assistance
really
programs.
flexible, small amounts of dollars that could prevent something. For example, the example we were given in training was an aunt was willing to keep the person, however, they didn't pay their $200 rent. So they're going into shelter that night. They'll have it next month. The aunt will let them back next month to pay that diversion, like at the shelter,
Like,
having
buy
diversion.
groceries for your mom, she might stay for another. Or you wait to find out who got that job after.
Flexible dollars at shelter point,
Yeah.
preventing that bed being taken. It's a good model. I think it's recommended, right?
Share some of that.
So that would be sort of the
extent of
scope
diversion.
beyond looking at the shelter.
To keep
But they might have already lost their place, but maybe they can go family member if they pay utility bill for 3
Right.
months or something.
Very flexible, not defined.
And then
dollars.
workers, of course, do things for.
Yes.
Well,
Right.
I'm just talking about sort of like scope at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
that might be a good model. There might be others. I don't know, but there is sort of like an at the door definition that we could use then in terms of diversion, rather than getting into the $1 million a month rental assistance program that we ran over the past few years on.
Although we should do that too.
Scope.
Can we visit that in how many months do we have to wait to revisit that?
In this, so I mean, I do want to ask this. Like, I think that that's a lot to take on, right? I mean, I think that this collaborative is full of extremely talented people, but I am concerned about getting too far off, and I think that that's a lot for us to take on, and I think that it has the highest. I think it has the highest amount of sort of immediate impact on, what perhaps sort of like the general public thinks about in terms of homelessness, and the homelessness problem.
I'm fine with the scope. I was capturing. I'm fine.
So-
No, I'm totally, like, I didn't
But
mean to
okay.
say I wasn't fine with, I'm totally fine with the scope.
It sounds
I
like
was saying that
it-
to just emphasize the prevention is important, and I agree, the prevention. is
So it sounds like
I agree.
we're in alignment on that scope for the sort of like the bulk of the work. Are there other things though that we need to have on our agenda moving forward? Should we be thinking about smaller, some smaller breakouts and really resisting the subcommittee concept. But are there other sort of immediate needs? And I have two on my list just to sort of maybe get you thinking. But Steve, I don't know what we do with unaccompanied youth. Then if there's a youth advisory board that we have, is that an area where we should sort of try to? It doesn't necessarily affect everyone around the table either, right? I think that the scope that we just defined is pretty universally applied. I think is universally applied to the membership of the collaborative. But that would be sort of a sub area for us to look at. The other one, might be the immediate shelter operations, because we've had several shelters that have said that they are not sure how they're going to stay open past whatever date, and that there is somewhat of a risk that we could lose some of our system because it was expanded during the pandemic with other one-time resources, and now we have to figure out how to sort of at least not lose them, I think, in the short term. So those would be two examples, but let's start with the unaccompanied youth. That's even a different category than I think what you were talking about.
So in Delaware, they do not have a process in Delaware for a minor to be emancipated from their parents. So if you come across a youth that you say is unaccompanied, we would refer to that youth as a child that is dependent. You call the hotline, then they would come into DFS custody to petition the court for custody. There should never be a time when the child is just unaccompanied. If that's the case, they would only be dependent. So we would not see, a time when 15 or 16 years old coming to a shelter, and the shelter would not then think, oh, okay, this is a call the hotline. This is not someone that we would take in. For the youth that are aging out of foster care, it's, a lot of times the family has been involved in our system for long enough time that they choose not to be involved in it anymore. So any youth that ages out of foster care in our state has the ability for independent living services through us until age 23. So those that are showing up at a shelter on their 18th birthday have turned down the independent living programs offered by us at the state. Again, been in the system since you were 3 or 12. Sometimes you just want to try it on your own for a while, right? But we don't turn it off. It used to be a process that if you said, I don't want to be an independent living, you couldn't really get back in. We changed that years ago. So you age out of foster care, and then you're 21 and a half, and so hey, I want to take advantage of the independent living programs. You come back to us until you're age 23. And there's obligations there, right? There's things that need to be followed for that to happen for us. But we kind of have that open with open arms on our end. So really shouldn't have an unaccompanied child. That would be a dependent child. Need to be called.
To prevent the subcommittee, like for example, COC is doing, we're working with Suzanne Wagner on a blueprint, so like perhaps individual opponents are working on something that could, instead of doing it twice, like bring back to the group, as a support to the class. You know what I mean? Like just thinking about our blueprint is going to be hopefully a big piece of something we can present and be part of, getting into our systems here.
Sure.
There might be other work happening, where we can be focused. Yeah, that's like you said, it's just too big. And you have to focus on. But then you start. Of course, we want to do the prevention part. We want to be that children do matter, right? That it's a whole different beast, right? But we talk about homelessness. We talk about the families. It's a very different than really the shelters.
On the unaccompanied youth side, though, if they're resisting placement in foster care, if they leave foster care repeatedly, is that something we don't see much. I remember from.
It happens. You don't see it much. You've probably heard our department talk about youth living in our offices, spending a night or two in our office and sometimes a week or two because they're refusing to go to a placement that has been found for them. We are not able to abridge their freedoms, right? We can't.
Yeah.
We can't say that's the foster home you're going to if they choose not to go. And we have to abide by that, but it's not a law they're breaking. So it's not that we wouldn't put them in a shelter. We continue to work on finding them a placement.
And I think there's
Stay with us
cities
the
in
whole
Philadelphia
time.
and Baltimore and Pittsburgh, other places I've worked at, those are real issues of younger people that are just resisting the system.
I've got a lot to have that.
Yeah.
But we would not consider them homeless. We consider them our work, basically, right? Like, they're in DFS custody. We're not gonna let them go out and be homeless. Now, if they run out of our offices, they knock on the door at 3 a.m.
Yep.
Ring the door at 3 a.m. You know, we've been looking for them ever since we called the police. It's just not something that we would say, oh, I'm gonna call a shelter as a placement. It's not something that would be acceptable. It's gonna have to be a licensed foster placement or
Well, you're talking about folks under 18. So, and I think, again, this comes back to how different systems define different groups, but like when we talk about unaccompanied youth homelessness in continuum of care land, we're talking about folks who are 18 to 24 who are experiencing literal homelessness in some way. Some of them, many of them, though not all of them by any means, have foster care history. Some folks don't. A lot of folks don't, and have lost housing for a lot of times at that age. It has to do with families. LGBTQ plus population is very overrepresented in the homeless population. If you've done your homes or lost identity, so that whole population is its own thing, and that's how we define it. In continuum of care land. And there is a youth advisory board that's managed by Weston Front House. It hasn't quite, I think most of the membership, so it's made up of youth. Most of the membership at this point is information specific, getting services or has gotten services from Weston specifically. So it's not necessarily statewide representative, but they've been working the last couple of years to get some.
Steve, I never do that. About if somebody with the foster care and left, and they were under 23, they could.
Yeah, so if they celebrate their 18th birthday, they are still in foster care. That's what people refer to as aging out of foster care. They were in it until their 18th birthday. They're eligible for independent living. And it's, again, Weston Neighborhood House has places in Wilmington recently started a different model, but it's a home in Sussex County. It's on 26 or 60. Remember which was the one that
I was there, but I have no idea what
They have like 10 beds there. They each have their own room, their own bathroom, and then there's a common living space in the kitchen. They have that available to them. Well, but again, they don't all want to be there. So imagine a lot of times you should grow up in foster care, and then you're now an adult, you're trying to do your own thing. A lot of them choose not to live in another foster care like, system. Right, they want to kind of have their own place. So I think the places in Wilmington typically they tend to be full more because it is more like an apartment or 2 or 3 people sharing an apartment. The one in Sussex is brand new. So, I know it's a great option for our folks in Sussex. We refer to the young adults, right? The young adults in Sussex County, because it's a little different for them. Even though they might have been in foster care, a lot of times they have an informal support system. That informal support system for them was all in Sussex County. And to have them move up to Wilmington, they're kind of starting from scratch in that case. We're really happy to have Sussex. It's just started. They've been a great partner for us. So they do congregate foster care for you under 18, and then they have independent living apartments as well. Great over, and Mr. Cobb has been a wonderful partner for us.
Any other thoughts on things that we need to take a look at more immediately? I mean, what's been happening with the mayor's? Um, is it a
Like the, that we have our homes.
yes?
So currently they have a 180-day timeline. So they're about halfway through that work right now. And our hope is they will come forward with several recommendations about how we can address particularly on shelter. So we're currently working with their providers in the city to figure out what the best approach will look like. We've looked at some things like a day center, some other options, but how we can better support services currently isn't a lot of what our role is.
If I can throw in here. I had a shelter, this organization. Also, which because there was somebody who's in charge, just kind of collapsed. But before that, I want to get some clarification. My question about the sincerity to the organization. It's not like it's
Um, we're let's get public comment and then let's talk a little bit about we want to put on the agenda for our next meeting. So let's start with anyone in the room.
So glad to hear what you all are working on and focusing on conversations. Really positive in terms of how can we work collaboratively in the state of Delaware to try to make an impact. Given the fact that we have no idea what parties outside of the state of Delaware. Really appreciate the chance to hear it and
What else? Can we take any comments from online or is that? Okay. Okay, so next meeting, we're going to, I think, send back out a request to sort of refine those survey results, both based on sort of a better understanding of, and I appreciate the conversation today a lot on the different programs that might have subcategories, the scope, redefining the scope that we discussed, and thinking through how to get a better set of data points for how the system is currently funded by the members of the collaborative. Should we be thinking about in that context the supportive services, or do we sort of push that out a little bit further and like housing navigators or street outreach? Do we ask for information in those categories as well, or do we push that out a little bit more?
If you're focusing on this population, one of people with street outreach, I don't know, community navigators. It'd be the whole continuum of the unhoused population, but it's great option, right?
Yes. I would definitely use that.
Okay. What about the navigator concept?
If there are housing navigators. So yes, but again, I think it's across my understanding, working with a lot of partners, Delaware, so a lot of people define that differently. So just making sure that if you're asking, what is that? It's, are you funding housing navigation services for people who are currently on the streets and in shelters? Right, like I know some of the shelter, some that might overlap with rapid housing, but rapid housing providers have housing navigators to help them get rapid housing. But anyway, so yes, but I think you just have to define by it, or you're gonna get a lot of different.
And so, and we were talking then also, so our scope again is sort of the shelter and emergency housing system, as well as the admin board diversion.
And when you say that system, you also mean like how, within that system, there should be housing navigators. Every time someone comes into a shelter, they're connected to someone whose goal is to help them get housed quickly. Connected to the services they need, they do that, stay housed. I think that's a really critical part of what is, or I think in this case is not happening in that system. It should be, and I don't want to be part of it. So.
But is that the navigators? Is that how to, if we can find that the right way, is that what that is?
Yeah, or that like financial assistance, right? So a lot of times you're gonna need like help with first month's rent, on security deposit. So some of that is part of that getting out. There's usually services and financial assistance for most people. A lot of people self-resolve shelter system without that.
Are there any national standards or evidence-based practices that comes with this?
For the definitions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, just from a model for this sort of. Yeah, I think that'd be really neat, like, if you look at what other states are doing, you know, or in terms of like best practices.
Yeah, I think, so I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that I keep saying, I think we, you know, as a society, I think we have discovered what works. I don't think part of what I hope we can get to is sort of matching the best practices with what we're doing in Delaware, and I don't think there's going to be a perfect match there. And so, you know, how do we move the system that we sort of discovered through this process and map out through this process? How do we move into one that follows best practices? And to me, that is the timeline. It's the supportive services. It's you know, some of these components that we talked about, but I don't think it's you know, low barrier entry. I think there's a lot of things that that we can change in our system to make it work better. Yeah.
They also can help be including like the grassroots, the unfunded, like the all the kind of little pockets that aren't kind of in the main system, right? Like the Rotary houses and those kinds of things, like Sunday breakfast mission, maybe. Or are we just looking at the state and federal? Because those, the grassroots efforts can and should be part of it, I think. And our resources are just kind of, you know, out there in the individual communities. I think when we think about the shelter system, there are some that are just not participating, but are part of this solution. Yeah.
So like when I think about them as kind of two different, one is like, what is the current system, which includes everybody is within the system. regardless of whether they get state or federal money or whatever. And then what are the resources that has control over? Right, there are kind of two different questions.
Right,
But yeah, I feel like you have to get an answer.
identifying that, yeah. Even just listing it would be important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we have the whole. So we have all the shelters, know what they are, know that they have, know what types of households they serve. Those things about how like funding they get, we already have a lot of that. So whether it's like insurance or folks,
Yeah, I think this is the reason that this is where we started the homework. I think it's because this is the piece that I think we haven't known as much about. And I think that, yes, we need to sort of, at some point, we need to, I don't know if we'll be ready by next meeting to do that or not, but if we are, we'll try to bring it. Or maybe at least present it. Okay. Anything else that we should, so that's the homework assignment, right, is to sort of re-ask these questions from our team at DSHA to the members of the collaborative to submit revised, more detailed version of that survey that went out. And then we can present that at the next meeting. What other agenda items would you like to see? Do you want to get into that other side of it, the presentation on that data that you just talked about?
like the shelter, where shelters are, they sort of how many beds they have, like, yep. But the thing that we know, looking at it again. We know all the federal funding that the shelters get. I'm pretty sure we also know which ones get HSS, right? Don't necessarily, the only thing we might not know is which ones get the state.
What about even smaller?
You know that.
Well, I could, but what about the smaller?
So we do know most state and federal money. We also know which, I was just trying to picture.
What about you?
Right, there's, so those are all, so all the ones are on there that like, we know of. So things like Redemption City's on there, things like Philadelphia Arms is on there. Again, but like if there are, we should look at that. Right, but I'm sure there's missing, like churches for, like, there are churches all over the state that'll pay some of the state hotel for fee. Like, we don't have that on there.
But they are supposed to be, at least in Sussex, my understanding is there is a homelessness regulatory body that you're supposed to get like thing for.
Yeah, right. That doesn't happen in Sussex as much as it should probably. Oh, you're talking about 3/4 houses, or are you just talking about?
Yeah, that's,
Okay, that's different than what I'm thinking. I'm thinking like Grace UMC has a house that they struggle people. Nazarene, same thing. You know, there's all those little pockets that are doing big work, but not connected.
So, yeah, for homeless shelters, there's no real regulatory framework.
Okay.
And then we were talking about 3/4, which is another piece, which is big. Yes. In Sussex, it's big.
So can we call that sort of a provider like a presentation of the providers in the state? And I mean, I don't, at this point, let's not ask for anything new. You know, present the information you have, and if we can identify gaps that we need to fill in, then, you know, we can talk about that. And anything else on the agenda for next? You guys want to talk about your blueprint? Are you ready for that yet? Not quite.
You know what that meeting? Because it depends on whether.
Good question.
Yeah.
So our
That's what I look at, Melissa.
our goal is to have it ready by mid-August.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm allowed to say one, but can I?
absolutely.
Okay.
Don't want an announcement.
There be an announcement?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead, Mimi. Can I?
Sure. So the University of Delaware is going to speak its second annual conference in August. The date is August 14th. one day conference attended board, marked the executive conference center. And its focus is on local and state collaborations to challenge the current state of in Delaware. The opportunity, so including working here in Brentwood, to serve very to learn more about the opioid funding. So Rachel's conversation time is really neat. Oh, it just mentioned it, we want to deal with this safe behavior restriction.
I will share it out too as soon as it goes out, which I think you said was like tomorrow or the next day. But the goal is that the blueprint would be kind of like done by then, so that we can talk about it there.
Talk about it, really focus on it and what.
Right. Right. So depending on the next.
We have a date for the next meeting. So it'll be after that?
Yeah.
Is that good timing for people generally? And I'm not asking about your calendars, but is that enough time, too much time? Should we try to meet before that conference or? I know July's over. I mean, it's just, but
It's already August
it's pretty much over. Yeah, yeah.
From my perspective, it's not a problem. You guys have had a chance to discuss it, brought some of that to our conference, shared with Rob, but obviously.
Okay, let's see if we can do that. With the survey process, it takes a little bit of time for us to put the questions together and get it out and give enough people enough time and then enough back. So, but we'll see. You know, that's probably so we'd be shooting for like a month or so, right?
It's too long to finish.
Pretty sure that's my wedding anniversary, but that's fine. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure. I
Talking
think
about
that's
someone's gonna be so fast.
I feel like I should check in. Yes.
My only concern with August 5th is, again, getting your survey responses back. Organizations like DHSS, which.
They had a lot, yeah,
They had
yeah.
a lot.
If Secretary Manning were here, she would be saying,
So, the members of the collaborative have the capacity to bring this around.
yeah. Well, let's try it. Let's look for something in that range. Maybe not that, but we'll figure that out. But it seems like that might be, even if you're not buttoned up completely, when you put the blueprint on the agenda, that's a good point for talking about it.
Okay. I can't, it doesn't work for me. If I'm gonna be presenting some things, but other days that we do. So.
And even if we don't appreciate any participation or communication.
Sure.
Share our comments, really.
Yeah.
Not trying to control your calendars.
Okay. Anything else for the agenda?
With the survey, just tying back to as much data that we can get tied to the number of people served. I think is critical for, time. I know that's in the weeds a little bit, but.
Well, and I'm not
If you can
sure.
crack, if there's any way to, it's like we saw the Delaware State Housing Authority dollars.
Yep.
But number of people, just, that's just my thought process. People think about that. How much their dollar goes towards the. That might be too much in the weeds, but anytime. you're
Well, I'm
talking-
wondering if that's linked to the funding or to the reporting. Those are two different questions.
Right.
To ask, I think, of a provider.
It might not be
funder.
relevant for every survey question.
Yeah.
Or survey participant. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, we'll think that through a little bit. Okay. Anything else? Any other comments? Any other thoughts? Okay. We adjourn. Thank you.
That's not it.